Well, good morning, everyone. This must be one of the only times of the year that we say that it's okay to go outside in the middle of the night and sing very loudly in front of other people's houses. But I wonder what your favorite carol is and what you might be hoping to sing this year. One of my favorites is Come, O Come, Emmanuel. But there is a long history of singing carols. It goes right back to the early Christians. And a carol is a song of joy and praise. And the very early ones included dancing as well. Maybe we can bring that back for the carol service as well. But they really started gaining momentum in the 11th century when Francis of Assisi would take a nativity show around and the performers would sing carols. And actually, carols were sung at lots of celebrations. There was joy and praise at lots of different special festivals and celebrations. But the tradition of just singing them at Christmas has been passed down to us. And they gained momentum all through the Elizabethan times. There were many written then. Unfortunately, when the Puritans were about, they kind of put a stop to the carols. They were a really fun bunch, obviously. But then in Victorian times, it really gained popularity for carol services and singing in front of people's houses, going and caroling. Now, normally, I'm a little bit of a Scrooge, and I don't like Christmas before December. But actually, when I get into December and I start singing carols, then actually I get into it and I start to belt them out. We asked our Google speaker this morning to play Christmas carols, and the first song it played was Michael Bublé, All I Want for Christmas Is You. So I'm not sure it quite got the idea. But during Advent, we are going to be focusing on different carols in our series, Comfort and Joy. We're going to focus on lines from different Christmas carols. We're going to be focusing on joy from Jesus and praising him. And the line today that we're going to look at is from the carol, God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, or you might know it as Tidings of Comfort and Joy. And as Ant mentioned, we're going to look at that line. He's come to save us from Satan's power. Let me just pray. Lord, we approach you with joy. We seek you as the source of joy. We come and praise you this morning. And as we think about the victory that Jesus has and all he came to this earth to do, and the freedom that he gives us, Lord, I pray that you would open our hearts to hear from your Spirit this morning, to hear your word to each of us, that we would hear clearly from you, Lord. Amen. I'm going to tell you about 3 babies. The first baby came to earth in a remote location, was raised by 2 loving parents, and as he grew up, he was a bit different from the other children. He was stronger and faster. But as he grew, on the outside, you would know no difference whatsoever. Seemed like everybody else. But this boy grew into a man that could do amazing things, and he went on to save the world from the oppression of evil and from destruction. Baby number 2 was born to parents in slavery. He had to be evacuated in case he was murdered, and he was floated down a river. And he actually grew up in a palace like a prince, but then had to escape when he committed murder. And he escaped into the desert and there had an encounter with God and was called to lead. And he went back home, and by the power of God, he helped to liberate his people from slavery. And the third baby was born in poverty. He was also born in a remote location and grew up in a remote location. And he was a little bit different from the other children around. Probably got into trouble a little bit less. And he looked just like everybody else on the outside. But when he grew up, he did amazing things. He spoke in such an amazing way and did miraculous things. But he was put to death in the most shameful and painful way. But he rose again in victory, and he didn't just liberate a community or a people group. He liberated the whole world. Now, if you have been around church long enough to be dangerous, you might know that two of those are characters from the Bible. The first one, though, was Superman. But that story of a hero who looks just like one of us but can do amazing things and changes the world never gets old. The other two babies were Moses and Jesus. And I mention Moses because the first hearers and readers of that section of Colossians would have had Moses and the Exodus in mind. And certainly the Apostle Paul, as a Jewish Christian, writing words like delivered and redemption, would have had the Exodus story ringing in his mind. And we'll come back to him in a minute. Now, Advent is a time that is about waiting. But I don't know about you, it's also a time of disruption. There's this event to go to, there's this party, there's this performance, there's this service to go to, and they just get in the way of other events and parties and services and performances to go to, and that all gets in the way of normal life that has to carry on to a certain extent, and you have to buy all these presents, and you need to get all this other stuff to make it Christmassy. Advent is a time of waiting, but it's also a time of disruption. And like I said, once it gets to December, I actually quite like that stuff. But maybe for you, Advent is a time where you just dread it. You're dreading Christmas. It's a long, drawn-out process, or even a painful process. But the children of Israel have been waiting a long time for Moses. They've been waiting a long time to be rescued from slavery. But God says to Moses in Exodus 3, verse 9, excuse me, now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. God saw the problem and intervened. God came and helped and liberated his people from slavery. And they waited for a while. And there was a huge disruption in Egypt. Moses came in and caused disruption in Pharaoh's court. There was a whole people group that just left an area. There were signs from God that caused huge disruption. And a workforce, even if they had been forced to, just down tools and left. They'd been waiting for ages. And then there was huge disruption. You see, a move of God is preceded by a period of waiting and causes disruption. I was reminded this week of how the Bible is mostly filled up with waiting. Noah was waiting for a flood, although he kept himself busy building a boat. Abraham waited for a child and heir. The children of Israel waited to return from exile. And after Jesus' ascension to heaven, his first followers waited for a move of the Spirit. See, visible in action doesn't mean God isn't working. We sang about that in the Waymaker song this morning. Just because we don't see God working doesn't mean he's moving. Doesn't mean he's not in control. And a move of God does cause disruption. If you think about the birth of Jesus, there's a young girl who is stigmatized, probably for life. There's a capital city in uproar because there's news of a new king. And there's shepherds shouting in the street and waking everybody up because they have such great news to share. And that didn't stop at Jesus' birth. His followers kept causing a disruption. At Pentecost, when the disciples spill out onto the streets, they're accused of being drunk. And later on, there's a Roman soldier who says that the Christians are turning the world upside down. What is it that you are waiting for God to do? What disruption would you like to see? A friend or family member, a friend or family member become a Christian? Is there a healing you want to see in yourself or somebody else? Does there need to be reconciliation between friends and family? I'm sure we can all think of a global problem that we want God to sort out. Do you want inspiration or just to hear clearly from God? What are we waiting for God to do? What disruption do you want him to cause? Visible in action doesn't mean God isn't working. You see, a move of God comes after a period of waiting and causes disruption. I remember one nativity play I was in primary school. And I must have been a little bit older in primary school because I really wanted to be Joseph. And the teacher held little audition for it, and I learnt my line, and I did the audition, and I got the part of a blind man. I was a fictitious character that took the last room in the inn before Mary and Joseph got there. But I thought, I'm going to learn my line, I'm going to deliver it, I'm going to show that teacher. And the night of the performance came, and it was coming up to my part in it. And the village hall was packed. And all of a sudden, this little voice could be heard, I don't want to go on. I got stage fright and wouldn't go on. And this teacher unceremoniously pushes me onto the stage. And somebody, I've no idea who, delivers my line. And do you know the worst thing? My parents bought the video of that performance. It scars me still deep. But I'd been waiting for that. But the disruption I caused was not good. It was not helpful. And it didn't do anything to add to the performance. But humanity had been waiting for Jesus even longer. Right back in Genesis 3, it was promised that he would come and bruise the enemy's head. He'd been promised again and again and again. And for example, 750 years before his birth, Isaiah prophesied, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel. They waited a long time for Jesus, the Messiah. And as we've already thought, he did cause disruption, but in a good way, not in a bad way. There was disruption around his birth. He taught amazingly. He healed on the Sabbath, and that upset some. And even after his death, as we thought, he was still causing a disruption. You see, the comfort and joy Jesus brings comes through waiting and disruption. The comfort and joy that Jesus brings comes through disruption. Excuse me. I've been tested. I'm all right. Don't worry. If we go back to Colossians, verse 13, at the end of the section, it says, "For he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness." Thank you. "For he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves." He's rescued us. He has freed us. If you think about Superman again, or another hero, or even an action hero, when they come to save the victim or the end scene, there's always huge disruption. The superhero flies through a wall, or at the very least, there is property damage. You might even, in an action film, see the police captain complaining about the bill from the city government. Jesus caused disruption to the dominion and power of darkness. Not only in his life did he cause disruption in the physical world, in his death and resurrection, and in his life, he caused disruption in a spiritual realm. When God became a baby, the powers of darkness and the enemy of God tried to disrupt it. They affected the leaders to try and murder the baby. When he was older and in the wilderness, he was tempted, but he resisted completely. And the enemy left with his tail between his legs. In his death, which looked like the ultimate victory for darkness, that was where he took on the powers of darkness and he defeated them. That's where he rose again to show that he has power over it, that he has broken the chain, that he has freed us, that he has saved us from Satan's power. He is now the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. There is a spiritual battle, but we do not need to fear because Jesus already has the victory. Jesus has already freed us. There is obviously still some darkness in the world, but that's because the enemy is in his death throes and just trying to take down as many people with him as he can. But Jesus has the victory. So what is the dominion of darkness? Anywhere God's light doesn't shine. Anywhere where Jesus is not king. Anywhere, any system in the world that doesn't have God at the center. Wherever there is oppression, there is darkness. Wherever there is hate and violence, there is darkness. Wherever there is disease and death, there is darkness. And Jesus has overcome them all. He's come to save us from Satan's power. That's who we are anticipating in Advent. That's who we're waiting for. But that's what we've been freed from. But we've also been freed to do something. We've been freed for a purpose. Now, I don't know how many of you drive, but when I grew up in a small village, and I just couldn't wait to get out of there. And when you're a teenager, the way to get out of a small village is learning to drive. And I learned to drive as soon as I could and as quick as I could and get those L plates off and get some freedom. The only trouble is, once I learned to drive, I went everywhere on the red line of the rev limiter. Oh, it's 30 miles an hour. We'll accelerate as fast as we can to 30. It's 50. Obviously, I stayed within the speed limit. It's 50. We're going to accelerate as fast as we can. It's 60. Accelerate as fast as we can. You see, as a young driver, I loved my freedom. The only trouble was I was not very responsible. And if I'm honest, it took 5 days to write a car off after passing my test. But that's another story. Technically not my fault. But when there's freedom, there is also responsibility. In verses 10 and 11 of Colossians chapter 1, They make up a prayer from Paul. Paul is praying that the Colossians would live life in a certain way because of the freedom that God has given them. We live in this freedom, and these are ways that we are free to live. Paul firstly prays that they would bear fruit. They are free to bear fruit. They are free to live a life like Jesus, in the image of Jesus. Later, Paul says the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. That list may sound a bit meek and mild, but to the systems of the world, to the powers of darkness, that is disruptive. Because that looks like sharing faith. That looks like caring for humanity, particularly the marginalized. It means standing up for injustices, and it means trying to bring God's kingdom into the world. But we are also free to grow. Paul prays that the Colossians would grow. When there's this life is lived out, when this life in the image of Jesus, when this life of living the fruit of the Spirit is lived out, there's a need to go deeper with Jesus, to grow in faith, to grow in relationship, and grow as a child of God. And that only becomes more and more disruptive. It means that more and more we will want to build his kingdom and for his kingdom to come in this world. Thirdly, Paul prays to be strengthened. People around the world know this more than we do, but there is opposition. There was opposition at Jesus' birth, and there is opposition to faith. There is opposition to a life lived in the image of Jesus. Paul says in verse 9 of Colossians 1 that he prays for them to be filled with the Spirit. Not just that they'll be filled with power, obviously he wants that, but he prays that they will be filled with wisdom and understanding, that they will know the mind of God. They will know God's will in their life. When we seek God, we are strengthened. When we wait on God, when we listen, when we seek the Spirit and the move of the Spirit, we are strengthened. When we wait on God, we are strengthened. And fourthly, Paul prays that the Colossians would give thanks. We can take our disruptive life and our waiting on God and turn it into praise and worship. It's in worship that we are re-energized to keep going, to start that process all over again. In worship is where we meet with God. See, the comfort and joy that Jesus brings comes through waiting and disruption. Now, one of the people that we hear about often in Advent is John the Baptist, who was born about 6 months before Jesus. And his father, Zechariah, had an amazing prophecy. Zechariah was a priest who'd been in the temple, and it was his turn to offer worship. And there he was visited by an angel, and Zechariah had been waiting. Like everyone, he'd been waiting for the Messiah, but he'd also been waiting for a child. And him and his wife were getting on in years, and it seemed unlikely. And the angel said, "You're going to have a child, a son, and not only that, they are going to point towards the Messiah." It's kind of a double whammy on that one. But Zechariah was skeptical. And in fact, his skepticism led him to be unable to talk. And he was unable to talk until his son was born, until he named him John. And when he could talk, he prophesied. And the prophecy is amazing. In Luke chapter 1:67, it says, his father Zechariah, filled with the Holy Spirit, and prophesied, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has come to his people and redeemed them. He has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, as he said through his holy prophets long ago, salvation from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us, to show mercy to our ancestors and to remember his holy covenant, the oath he swore to our father Abraham, to rescue us from the hand of our enemies and to enable us to serve him without fear in holiness and righteousness before him all our days. And you, my child, will be called the prophet of the Most High, for you will go before the presence of you will go before the Lord and prepare the way for him, to give his people the knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven and shine on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death, and to guide our feet in the path of peace. Zechariah understood the need for waiting and disruption. He prophesied that Jesus would come and shine in the darkness, and he did. The enemy is in death throes, but Jesus has the victory. Jesus has freed us. And there's going to, excuse me, it's gone again. He has brought us into his kingdom. And one day there will be no darkness. But now we do experience some darkness. But Jesus offers us freedom now and ultimate freedom in the future. What is the darkness affecting you? Is it illness and pain? Is it disagreements? Is it stuck in bad habits or even addiction? Is it stuck in guilt and shame? Is it stuck in anxiety? All of these things Jesus offers us freedom from. And the comfort and joy from Jesus comes through waiting and disruption. So that's what we're going to do now. We are going to wait. We're going to wait for the Spirit. We're going to wait to see what the Spirit wants to do.